These are the Eagle Sticks of Support Commando of the Rhodesian Light Infantry, average age about 20. But they're probably the world's most experienced operational parachutists. During their 6-week bush tours, they sometimes jump 3 times into battle in 24 hours. The aircraft is older, a Dakota made in 1942 and said to have dropped British Paras at Arnhem. 5 minutes after the scramble siren, the Paras are airborne and heading for their target. Except for brief bits of information passed back by the pilot, these men will know little about the enemy's strength until they hit the ground. This time we didn't know where we were going, only our flying time to the target, 10 minutes. The Paras exit at faster than 1 per second. At 400 feet there's barely time to use the reserve parachute. But the low drop also means that you only hang in the air as a helpless target for about 10 seconds. My chute landed in the trees, and some parachutists had to hit their quick release boxes to get out of their harnesses hanging in the branches. We'd been dropped on a possible escape route, but the guerrillas were holed up on a wooded hill and a chopper swooped down to take the Paras off to reinforce their comrades. Soon we were pinned down by heavy fire coming from the hill. Then the man on my left gave a shout of warning. There's a man in the gully, and he moved forward ready to fire. But the guerrilla was surrendering. He stumbled out, wounded in the arm and the leg. "I want to join the Rhodesian forces," he said. "I was on my way." While he was being searched, we came under fire again. For 7 hours the Rhodesians battled through the rocks and caves of the hill, dangerous country which had claimed the life of a young officer 2 days before. The parachute commander called for an airstrike, marking the position with a yellow smoke grenade. Further on, we found a guerrilla killed by the strike. This smoke was from a guerrilla grenade which just missed the soldiers sheltering behind the rocks. Fires were started by the grenades and tracer bullets. This cave was the last of the guerrilla camp to fall, taken by a young soldier who crawled up and lobbed in a grenade. Richard Cecil for News at 10, Fort Victoria, Rhodesia.
Well, I'm very, very happy to say I've got Nigel Henson back with us today. And I've got a rough idea of what Nigel's going to talk about, and I'm absolutely fascinated. Although I was involved as well, there's so much about this war that I certainly didn't know. And Nigel is in a position to give us some very, very interesting insight based on an incredible amount of experience. Having said that, Nigel, let's get back to where we left off last time, and let's get right into it. And I know it's going to get very interesting and exciting from here on, because 1977, you were posted to Support Commando to take over from, if my memory serves me correctly, from Pat Armstrong, which I'm sure was quite a tough act to follow. But if you pick up with that, you know, the major in command of Support Commando.
Yeah, Hannes, when I was posted to Support Commando, I had mixed feelings. I mean, I was tremendously honored to be put in charge of a company like that. And at the same time, I felt great trepidation because I was taking over from an iconic leader who had wonderful support from his troops. He was worshipped, in fact, and a wonderful operational guy, and also a wonderful organizer, because he had really bought into being the modern support commander. I also had a lot of trepidation because, having done a little bit of Fire Force before with 6RR or something like that, I knew everyone's eyes would be on me. If we take it, the troopies, I mean, it was quite understandable that actually the troopies were the most interested in this because they had the most to lose. They were terribly concerned about any new guy that pitched and professed to know what he was talking about. Very important. And the troopies were terribly critical of anything that took place that might be construed as inefficiency or ignorance or something like that. I always remember after, I think, my second or third call out, in the middle of the evening, I happened to walk past this barrack room, and there was a troopie there who was not scared, in fact, to voice his opinions about anything, a guy called Dwinger. And he was carrying on about the boss should have done this, and I don't like the way the boss did this, and he should have told me to do this, and we should have put these guys there, etc., etc., etc. Anyway, I actually accepted his criticism because I knew actually that it was not my best day out. But I discussed the thing with my CSM, who is a wonderful guy called Phil Payne. So what we did at Pokey Drill the next day, before the day started, early in the morning PT, I announced to the whole commander in front of me that actually Dwinger was now the new OC, and that he should take his instructions from him. And Dwings, he actually, I called him to the front and I said, Dwinger, here you are, take over this Pokey Drill class now, which he made an effort to do, but he's terribly embarrassed. And then I made him sit with the officers at breakfast and have breakfast with us. And I put all my webbing on him so that actually he wouldn't, it would fit nicely when he was called out. And all the troopers in the meantime were walking past him, giving exaggerated salutes to him, morning sir, this kind of thing. And poor old Drinks, after about 3 hours, he'd had enough of this. He was out of there. But the point is that, I mean, their lives depended on the guy up there in the helicopter. And if he was not up to snuff, they let him know soon enough. Also, you know, it was the loneliest job in the world because the Air Force eyes were on you. They were very critical of any poor performance by any Army commander, because they'd come out of a situation a few years before where actually they believed that perhaps an Army commander in the K car was not necessary. And that had changed by the time I got there, but there was still this belief in some quarters in the Air Force. So they made no bones about criticizing if things didn't go well. And perhaps also very importantly was the Selous Scouts who inevitably called in the Fire Force. Now the Selous Scouts, they got bonuses for every enemy killed on the call out from them. And they were quite substantial bonuses. So boy, if you didn't perform, the report was back in comm ops in 5 minutes because actually they were out of pocket. And you'd get all kinds of phone calls from all kinds of quarters about, what did you do wrong and this and that and all the rest. So, you had to be really on your toes. And as I say, it was the loneliest job in the world because, you made a cock up. You didn't really have anyone to talk to. I mean, you couldn't talk to your CSM about it. You couldn't talk to your troop commanders or anyone like that. You just had to suffer in silence while these brooding eyes were upon you, full of criticism and a little bit sulky. Anyway, Support Commando at that time was organized into 4 troops. It was the biggest commando by far in the RLI. It was about double the size in numbers to a normal commando, and it had 4 troops: anti-tank troop, mortar troop, assault pioneer, and a recce troop. And some of the guys who were in there, the new subalterns, Joey Deploy, who unfortunately got killed in Puma 164 in Mapai. He was the troop commander of the mortar troop. Neil Jackson, who also wrote the book about Puma 164, he was one of the troop commanders, assault pioneer troop. Simon Willow, who is a wonderful guy, he was in charge of the anti-tank troop. And we had a guy called Mike Webb, ex-British Army, who is fairly unconventional in everything that he did, as in charge of the recce troop. And so, on that basis, we went to war. Now, I think before we start talking about war stories and how clever we were and all the rest, it's important to understand what the Fire Force did. The Fire Force was a term used to describe an airborne assault team that would eliminate terrorist gang of gangs. And it was made up of air elements and also of army elements. And the air elements primarily consisted of 4 or 5 helicopters, or however many were available, a parachute Dakota, and a light aircraft for ground attack and observation. And we're going to talk about how it works just now. Now, if we talk about another thing, Fire Force Commander, everyone thinks that actually, because you were called the Fire Force Commander, you were in charge of everything. Well, the reality of it was that you weren't. You were not in charge of the air elements at all. You were in charge of the ground troops. And so consequently, that term has been abused considerably. When you look at what happened and how things unfolded, although there was no command in the Air Force guy looked after the air, and I looked after the ground, there was no doubt about it that the guy who was more experienced, be it the KCOR pilot sitting next to the Army commander, or the Army commander sitting next to a relatively young and relatively inexperienced KCOR pilot, one of those two generally took the lead in any kind of call out and in any battle situation. And it came naturally, actually, but it wasn't something that I'm in command and you just sit back and keep your mouth shut. That's the way it worked. But, the term has been wrongly used to suggest that actually an Army commander or a Fire Force commander was in charge of everything. The other thing that we need to do is just discuss what is a contact. The contact is an engagement between friendly forces and the enemy. And in this context, when we talk about, you hear stories about 8 and 9 contacts a day by the Fire Force. Well, that's a lot of baloney. When I talk about a contact, I talk about an encounter with an enemy gang And if there's another encounter, it must be at least 10 kilometers from the previous encounter. So where you get a whole lot of guys scattering from an initial counter and you start killing them a few kilometers away or something like that, you get the wrong impression. Oh, I've had 5 contacts today, where in fact it was all those kills outside the immediate contact area were as a result of the initial engagement. The other thing we need to talk about quickly, we're all aware of what the Zulu Scouts did. They were actually pseudo-terrorists. And after the failure of security forces to be able to bring good intelligence into the war, the Zulu Scouts was formed. They were really pseudo-terrorists, and they acted as terrorists, and they infiltrated amongst the locals to discover where the enemy were. And generally speaking, when they found the enemy, what they would do is get on top of some kind of feature and act as an OP or observation point, and they would then direct them the fire force. Also, let's just talk quickly about the various helicopter configurations. The K car, which is basically the command car, consisted of a pilot and the army commander who sat in the front, the army commander facing backwards. And the pilot in particular was in a very heavily armored seat. And his vision at times was not all that great. The army commander had the best vision because he was in a lightly armored thing and he had a war flak jacket. And then you had the gunner who sat behind in the rear in charge of the 20mm cannon. And that was really the critical aircraft in the whole of this deployment. The other aircraft involved were generally called G cars, and they were typical Alouette 3 troop-carrying helicopters, also fitted with twin Browning machine guns, and the pilot sitting in a pretty heavily armored seat. Now, what would happen when we talk about deployment? There were, for each operational area, there was generally a fire force allocated to it. So we had Hurricanes sitting mainly in the Mount Darwin area. There would be a helicopter base. There would be a fire force base there. In Thrasher, which was down in the Mtali area, there'd be another fire force based at Grand Reef there. Similarly, in Repulse, which was in the southeast of the country, there would be a fire force based there, either in Cherezi or in Buffalo Range or even in Port Victoria. And as the Zulu Scouts were deployed into these areas, the fire force would react primarily to the intelligence that they gave. So the fire force was primarily there to support the troops in that particular operational area. And what would happen was, if there was a sighting or good intelligence on the whereabouts of a terrorist gang, the fire force would be deployed to neutralize it. Now, one needs to be very specific about what the fire force did. You hear war story after war story from all quarters that actually, you know what, we had a contact and we asked for the fire force and they wouldn't come. Or there was a landmine down there and we asked for the fire force to come and they didn't come. Or there was a store looted and the fire force never arrived. Well, in reality, that was not the fire force's job. The fire force's job was to eliminate the enemy and not to go and try and find the enemy. So the fire force should not in any way be deployed to follow up tracks from a landmine or come and look for terrorists in a particular area. The fire force was there to act on real-time intelligence. And so consequently, they came under a lot of criticism about, the fire force never arrived in that. And the K-car pilot, myself, we had virtually absolute authority and to decide which incident we would react to. And so consequently, when the Fire Force application for Fire Force was turned down, there were all kinds of mumbles and grumbles and that, but that's the reality of it. It was there to act on a specific target in real time. Okay, so the Fire Force gets called out. There'd be probably 4 helicopters waiting on the hard standing there, the deck, waiting with all the parachutes under its wings so the guys could kit up quickly. The Lynx or Trojan as a light support aircraft. And generally, the Fire Force consisted of 4 G-cars, 4 troop carrying vehicles, 4 troop carrying helicopters, and the K-car, and as I said, the Lynx and the deck. And the call out would come, the Air Force commander and I would evaluate the intelligence and decide whether we're going to go or not. And if we went, we would in great detail examine the map and listen to the report from the OP before setting out. And generally, we tried to make some kind of plan. You know, obviously, the essence of this thing was you had to act speedily. Otherwise, by the time you arrived there, the intelligence was no longer real time. The gooks had fled. But it was terribly important, as we discovered, to make a proper plan about this thing. It wasn't just a whole lot of oaks jump in helicopters and go and deal with a whole lot of the enemy down the road there. There was a very specific technique. There was a very specific way of doing this thing, and it was very important that you used the best quality troops that you could possibly do in the Fire Force action. Anyway, we'd have a briefing, then we'd get airborne. And on the way to the target, I would be discussing with the K-car pilot what we're going to do. And as soon as we were in range, we'd call up the OP and we'd say, okay, has your story changed from when it was from the initial briefing? And they would say, yes, it has, or no, it hasn't, but let's assume in this case it didn't. And then it came the question of making a lot of decisions. Of course, if a typical helicopter, you know, the K-car had longer endurance, maybe an hour and a quarter, depending on the amount of fuel that you put in. But the G-cars because they had to take off heavy with troops, they had about 45 minutes. So anything over about 20 minutes flying from where you initially went, you had to really stop and refuel, because the last thing you could afford to do was to get in there with a couple of 100 pounds of fuel in each aircraft, stay there for 10 minutes, and then the aircraft had to go back and refuel. So generally, on the way there, we'd be plotting where we were going to refuel, if it was quite a long sortie to get to the target. If it wasn't, obviously, we'd just continue there. And we'd be talking to the OP all the time. What we found was, as you probably know from your experience, is that the radio batteries issued to the Army and to everyone in the forces were notoriously unreliable. I think they made by a Kariba battery or somewhere. And you know, they'll suddenly go dead. So it was very important to remind the OP, I want you to change your batteries now. So he had a reasonable battery time in his radio as he's talking to you. And let's assume now we've either refueled or we've gone on straight to the target. When we're about 5 minutes out from the target and the K-car was leading and the G-cars would be strung out behind, the K-car would then say, okay, I'm pulling away. It would pull power and move away from the target. So that there was a little bit more of a surprise factor when only one aircraft arrived and only one aircraft was heard, as opposed to this great big cacophony of helicopters floating around. And then we'd always try and fly in over the OP. It was, say, for instance, on a little hill in front of us. When we're 2 minutes out, we'd pull up, say, pulling up, and all the time I'd be talking to the OP and making sure that the gooks were still there and nothing had changed. And we pull up to 800 feet, directly over, flying in a direct line between the OP and the terrorists. So as he was describing the target to us, we'd be looking at the same view. It was very unsatisfactory to come from either the left or the right or even head on to the OP, because his description sometimes of the target meant that you had difficulty in, but if you're looking at it from the same view as he was, made it an awful lot easier. And let's assume in this particular example that I'm giving you that no, we didn't see the terrorists when we arrived at the spot. I would throw out a smoke grenade, and the OP would then direct the K car from the smoke grenade, go right 50 meters, that's where the target is, add 200 meters or drop 100 meters. So all the time we were looking at the same target. And then the K car, all the aircraft used to orbit to the left. So the K car would go into an orbit at 800 feet above the position, and then we would start, the K car pilot and myself, start looking at how we were going to manage this thing. As we went on in the war, there wasn't any time to make plans when you got there. So generally speaking, on the way to the target, and depending on what the OP was telling us, we would actually make a plan and tell the helicopters to pre-drop their troops at certain points to try and envelop the target. And I think I'll just leave it there for the moment.
Just, if you can, just summarize what were the important components for a successful fire force call-out?
Okay, the first one was actually that you have to have real-time information. It's no good reacting to a store attack or mining incident or something that maybe happened last night. You never, the gooks won't be there anymore. Secondly, you needed a rapid response within reason. There's no good all piling into the aircraft and charging off with little thought about how you're going to manage this thing, how you're going to refuel, where your reinforcements were going to come from, etc. The next thing was most important, and people always tend to make light of it, is that you had to have the best troops available. And it had to be a very, very coordinated and practiced action between aircraft and soldiers. And after a bit, I mean, both the pilots and the soldiers were extremely practiced on this thing, and they knew each other, and you know, it worked very well. It was really a slick and coordinated effort. I just want to say something about troopers. You know, when I took over Support Commando, I inherited the most wonderful bunch of guys that could ever hope for. About 50% of them were national service, and about 50% of them were regular. But from our point of view, I mean, we didn't discriminate in any way. And they were the most uncomplaining, loyal, innovative, fantastic guys that any commander could ever have to. They were wonderful, really, truly. And I think, I mean, the RLI would be nothing without them. And they made their officers and they made their NCOs look good because they were so good. Mm. The other thing that was very important is that you had to have intimate command and control. You know, you hear things about guys get dropped on the ground and there's this chap sitting there in the helicopter, and the helicopter goes round and round while this chap tells them what to do. Well, the reality of it is that they're actually quite far from that. You had to know where every one of your soldiers was on the ground at any one particular point of time. And you'd fly around and you'd say to them, listen, you're coming up to a little riverbed. I don't like what I see in front of you. So for heaven's sake, be careful. Or, you know, the bush gets thicker on your left. Just watch what could happen from there. Except that very intimate control of every one of these guys. And I mean, it took quite a lot of effort because, you know, you could have 20 different call signs on the ground. You had to know who everyone was, what his call sign was, what you told him to do before, and what was expected of him. So, you know, you got a lot of guys that we thought they were airborne commanders, just flying around and waiting for something to happen. It wasn't like that at all. Intimate control of all of your call signs all of the time. And then you could react very quickly to whatever happened in front of them. The other thing that's terribly important is that, I've made the assumption so far that it was the target was static, i.e., when the helicopters were heard, the enemy remained in the same position as they were when they were first seen. But inevitably, and particularly in the early part of the war, as soon as a helicopter, anything was heard, they would scarper, and they would scarper in all different directions. They would bomb shell. And if you take an area like a target, say the area of 500 square meters, which is probably 20 meters by 20 meters, if they've had a chance to run for 1 minute, the target area goes from 500 square meters to 3 square kilometers. If they've had 3 minutes a notice to run, it goes to 16 square kilometers. 5 minutes, 31 square kilometers. Now, 31 square kilometers is almost the size of Ferrari. So it was terribly, terribly important that you used every kind of ruse that was available to you to try and mask sound of the helicopters and some kind of secrecy to achieve, that they had minimum time in which to scarper before the aircraft arrived. And there were ruses like we would always fly in downwind from upward, I think.
Into the wind.
Upward. So, in fact, quite a lot of the time, if the wind was strong, the whole fire force could arrive or overhead the target, and they'd hardly been heard. The other thing that we used to do was fly off maybe to a flank, the light aircraft or pro aircraft or something like that, at some distance from the target, so as to not disturb them, but so that they could hear them and say, oh, that's just a pro aircraft en routing from Mangula to Sipalilo or something like that. And that also tended to mask the sound of the helicopters. But once you arrived overhead, bedlam generally ensued. And if you read, there's a very excellent book by one of the original KCAR pilots, a chap called Mike Borlace, called Spider 07. And you actually read the prologue to that thing where he's running into the target. And that tells you so precisely about what happened. And the fact that everyone's nerves are on edge. There's a high anticipation, expecting all kinds of things to happen. Okay. Anyway, let's assume you're dealing with a target that's actually, the OP will tell you, oh, they started running now. And I just automatically look at my watch and say, okay. And by the time I arrived ahead, I would say, okay, they've been running for 2 minutes now. Therefore, I was placed by stops, enabled to contain the target area. I was placed by stops a certain distance away. Because if you thought maybe they'd been running for 5 minutes, and if you put your troops down inside where they'd already run, that was negated the whole process. So the terribly important thing to do was to contain the target area as much as you possibly could as soon as you arrived. And there were various ruses. Obviously, you had 4 sticks that you could in each GCAR, and they would fly a racetrack left-hand orbit around the target area, and they would gradually increase it, going further and further and further out, in the hope that their presence would in fact drive the enemy to ground, and that actually it gave the time to deploy the troops. Well, that worked some of the time. But the other things that we used to do, we would, if there were a lot of what we considered escape routes, i.e. re-entrance and heavily wooded areas that flowed out from the target area, what we would do is we would do dummy drops. And we would actually pretend to drop troops there, not drop. in the hope that actually the enemy fleeing from the target would say, oh, troops have just been dropped in front of me, I can't go that way. And to try and contain the area as much as we could. As soon as the troops were dropped, the first helicopter to drop his troops would then go and find a likely DZ, and that's a dropping zone for the parachutists. And he would charge off, and he would land in the DZ, what he considered melee land or something like that for the parachutists. And the parachutists, he would take the QNH of that particular, which is the barometric altitude pressure above sea level. So he could give it to the DAC and say QNH 1021 or something like that. Then the DAC could set his altimeter 400 feet above that, so that he would run in with exactly the right height above the ground to drop the parachuters. He also give the DAC.
Just talk about the importance of the paratroopers and how they became very much an integral part. I know it was a lot to do with the fact that there weren't enough helicopters to get troops on the ground. And that's why the paratroop element became so critically important.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, there's a lot of romance and myth and all kinds of things surrounding parachuting. And really, all it is a method, another method of delivering troops into an area in which you wish them to go. And really, you know, to suggest that there was something magical and mystical about this thing is not correct. And there were lots of limitations to dropping parachuters. Now, you can basically drop parachuters anywhere, but if the wind's too strong, they're going to get blown all over the place and suffer quite a lot of casualties. You can drop them in heavily wooded areas. You can drop them in a plantation of gum trees if you want to. But the reality is it'll take them about an hour to get out of their harnesses and climb down the tree. So one wants to avoid that kind of situation. In heavily wooded areas and very, very rocky areas, it was most inadvisable to drop parachutists in there. But sometimes there was no alternative because of the number of casualties that actually one sustained. And so consequently, the DAC carried 16 parachutists, and one hopes that at the end of the day, 16 arrived safely on the ground. You know, I always budgeted on the fact that maybe 2 or 3 guys would hurt themselves, and we would be left, instead of 4 parasticks in the DAC on the ground, we would be left with 3 or something like that, 3 and a bit. And generally, by the time the parachutists had dropped, the whole area around the target had been surrounded by the G-cars and drummy drops and faint airstrikes and that kind of thing. And the parachutists were generally put into some kind of sweep line where they would actually have to go and sweep the target. And the helicopter troops would act as in blocking positions. They were really, parachutists ready to flush the enemy out into the blocking positions of the stops.
It was a requirement of everyone in the RLI that they be para-trained. And so consequently, the para courses that went on shortly after I arrived were pretty intense. However, there was another side to this, because in some cases, a lot of hard-working, loyal and decorated soldiers were unable to come to terms with the parachuting concept. And so consequently, they were always deployed with the G-cars, and very little was said about the fact that they actually refused to carry out any para duties. The other interesting thing, of course, is that for a lot of these guys, and particularly African soldiers who were trained as paratroopers as well, they had never actually been in a fixed-wing aircraft. I mean, their army training consisted of really of helicopter trooping and that kind of thing. And consequently, you're actually it was quite a big ask of these guys that they, for the first time in their lives, they got into fixed-wing aircraft, and then 10 minutes later they were told to jump out of it. So, it took some doing.
One thing I've neglected to mention, and maybe we'll just put it in a little bit before, is in addition to the helicopter troops, we would send along a second wave. Now, the second wave generally consisted of perhaps a company 2RC and as many troops as were available, including cooks and bottle washers, maybe 20 or 30 troopies, spare fuel for the helicopters, maybe 10 drums, because if you were operating, say, at Rusapi, or some distance from Rusapi, you didn't want the aircraft to have to go all the way back to Rusapi to refuel. If your second wave got there quickly enough, they could refuel from the second wave. Also, spare ammo, spare cannon shells for the K-car, and quite a elaborate medical setup so that if anyone got hurt, we could at least deal with that. And this second wave would get going even before you'd left base when on the call out, because you'd say, okay, we've got to go to this place 10 kilometers south of Woodsy. Second wave, you go to Woodsy straight away now, before we even get airborne. So it gave them a chance to get there timelessly. But by the time their aircraft needed refueling, the second wave was in position.
You spoke earlier about the enemy running on once they knew something was on its way. But just talk about your experiences of how the enemy reacted in different situations. I'm sure there was a variety of reactions.
Yeah, when the fire force concept was first introduced, the enemy tended to panic. And for about 2 years afterwards, whenever a fire force arrived at the head, they would run in all directions, which was beautiful for the K-car, because once you'd spotted them, it was just a question of putting them away. And the cannon shell that was generally used in the K-car was a wonderful 20 millimeter thing, but it had a high explosive head, so that as it hit the ground, it burst like a grenade. And the cannon was zeroed at for 800 feet. So that was the height in which the K-car orbited. And it was an extremely accurate weapon. I mean, with a K-car, you could hit a running man. That's how accurate it was from 800 feet. And if they made the attempt to run over a bald hill or an area with lots of rocks, that was music to the ears, because all these grenades exploding amongst all the rocks and granite and that kind of thing caused a hell of a lot of damage. And you'd find that a lot of the enemy who weren't killed and you managed to capture, they were peppered. Their lower legs and limbs and their torsos were peppered with shrapnel wounds from the K-car. I just want to discuss some of the critical requirements that were necessary for a fire force operation. And then I'm talking about air aspects in particular. It was absolutely essential that for a successful call out, that you had air superiority. Now, when you think of air superiority, you think, well, I mean, the enemy hasn't got any fighter jets. We should have air superiority. Well, the reality is that actually, towards the end, the ground fire was extraordinary and extraordinarily accurate as well. And you had to be very careful when you approached the target. And certainly at the outset of some of these things, you did not have air superiority. You had an awful lot of flak exploding around in the sky, and you had to suppress it. So it was absolutely critical that before you started moving troops around or deploying troops, that actually you'd worked yourself into a position where the target had been suppressed and largely neutralized, and all the flak that was coming up, RPG rockets and tins of sudza and bloody rounds and grenades that had settled down and the target was neutralized. They got to into all kinds of ruses. With this, they would attach a whole lot of stick grenades and fire them into the air. So you got this necklace of stick grenades going on, which one had to be very cautious about. Anyway, that was one thing. Suppression of the target, terribly important. Also, the command and control of this fire force had to be really slick and well performed. And it wasn't a question of saying, you know, the Air Force is in charge of the aircraft and the Army guys in charge of the army. If you had a reasonably experienced KCAR pilot with you and you were involved in something else, I used to let the guy run the war. And similarly, when he had an issue with a couple of aircraft or refueling problems or rearming problems or calling for the Canberras or the Hunters or something like that, I would be directing helicopters to go and drop your troops there or go and do this or go and do that. And they'd be dropping on a different frequency. So that the teamwork was terribly important to the thing. And the teamwork went actually beyond that. Because, you know, every time the KCAR landed for refueling, I mean, you weren't there to sit there like Lord Muck and have a cigarette and think about it while the tech ran around. You got out and you bloody moved fuel drums and you moved boxes of ammunition and you did whatever was necessary physically, because there were only two of you and the tech, to carry out these. Also, I mean, while we were on the way to the target or whatever, I mean, there was a catering requirement on board the KCAR. Guys wanted cigarettes, guys wanted a tin of this or that, guys wanted a sip of lemon juice or whatever. So you were actually sitting there as the Army commander, you were actually the catering manager, because the pilot had to fly the aircraft, and the tech was watching all the time about what was going on in the instruments and that kind of thing. So he couldn't be the catering manager. So you'd light cigarettes for everyone, you'd pass around whatever grub was available, and you made the best of it. Some of the guys I worked with, I mean, all of them were wonderful, wonderful pilots. I mean, when I started working in the Fire Force, there were very experienced guys like Mike Paulus, Terence Murphy, and Pete Simmons, who you interviewed a few weeks ago. And, you know, being a reasonable greenhorn, relatively green to this thing, you actually let them manage the thing, because they had more experience and they knew what they were doing. And you were like trying to come to grips with all of this thing. And they were very good, but also they were very bloody tough on you. You know, they'd let you know if they weren't happy about what you were doing. And later on, as I became more confident and more versed in what I had to do, I started working with guys like Dick Paxton, who was the most marvelous guy you can ever imagine. So laid back. We all used to smoke Madison then, you know, which was like the cigarette of choice of all the guys in the KCAR. So you say to them, Dick, how far to the target? And you say, 1.5 Madison, because we all chain smoked like crazy. And listen, Major, I've only got 2 Madisons worth of fuel left. So you better make a plan about what you want to do, because we're going to have to duck just now. And he was the most wonderful, relaxed guy that you could ever imagine. Wonderful chap. Worked with a guy called Keith Spence, who came from Canberra, went on to helicopters and later back. Wonderful guy to work with, full of laughter all the time. Alistair Farragut, briefly Nigel Lamb, Bam Bam Marsdorp, as he was called, Dave Rowe, Ed Potterton, who was the boss of 7 Squadron. And I got on quite well with the guy. You know, there were all kinds of negative comments about Ed, but actually he had a terribly difficult job. I mean, with the kind of infrastructure for 1 squadron, of aircraft. He was probably running 4 squadrons worth of airplanes. I mean, he had like 40 or 50 aircraft there instead of 12. And so he had a very difficult job. But one thing I liked about Ed, every time he saw an opportunity, what was going on in the fire forces, he would never take the lead or anything like that. He'd sit back as Black Section number 3 or something like that. But he really made an effort to get out and find out what was happening with these guys. And also a guy called Luigi Mantovani, who was a wonderful pilot, wonderful guy, totally unflappable. He was an Italian, and he like, you know, no sweat, nothing's too much problem, you know, when you're getting the hell beaten out of you by groundfire. He would always say to me on the way to the target, he'd say, okay, Nigel, is it a brave day today, or is it not a brave day today? Are we, as a KCOM, going to be brave, or are we going to sit on the side? And I'd say, I don't know, Dick, Luigi, I'm not feeling too good. Maybe we have a medium brave day or something like that. But I mean, that was the kind of banter that used to go on in the cockpit all the time.
As an example of the South African support, Fire Force-wise, in the height of the war, here is a picture of Luigi Mantovani, who's opposite me, and myself. We were both bridge partners playing bridge together. And the other 3 guys that you see in the picture, Commandant van Rooyen from 16th Squadron of the SAF in Port Elizabeth, and 3 other pilots who were actually pilots. So in reality, in this fire force sitting there was 1 Rhodesian crew and 4 South African crews.
Nigel, there's I know this is a bone of contention, but I must tell you that a lot of people have said to me they rate you as one of, if not the best of the Fire Force commanders. I know you don't want to blow your own trumpet, but just talk about, I don't know, how do you respond to being considered better than the other guys? What did it involve?
Yeah, but I mean, you know, the statements like that are blindly made. But I mean, by what measure? Was I in charge of the fire force more often? Did the troops under my command kill more terrorists? Did I kill, did someone kill every time they were called out? They're so meticulous that they were called out to 10, they actually killed 10, and they wouldn't stop until they killed 10 or fined 10. And it boiled down to how many kills you got in a day and how many contacts you had in a day, and really, you know, how many contacts you had in the bush trip. So, you know, by what measure? Because the early fire force started, and there weren't too many groups around in those days in Mount Darwin. There might have been 100 in the whole of the Mount Darwin, Santini area when they started. And so consequently, the early guys, like Charlie Austin, Doug Lambert, they actually were developing this technique with the Air Force. And because they didn't have a lot of enemies, one can hardly say that they weren't the best, because one doesn't know. You know? And so as the war became more and more intense, and you were called out more and more often, things changed. Because, you know, we had 100 groups in an area the size of Mount Darwin. You got called out. Very seldom did you come back until you'd accounted for every one of them. That was in the 75, 76 era. Now, come the time of, towards the end of 79, when you get called out to target, and there are 10 guys there, let's say, and you account for 5 of them, or you can't, let's say you account for 8 of them. Then you hear about another target that's come off within like 10 minutes flying time away. Are you going to spend hours and hours and hours looking for the outstanding 2 on that one? Well, there's a possibility that the the target, by the finished time you found those two guys, the target of the other one would have disappeared. So I tended to look at this thing from the point of view of, okay, we've killed the majority of them, and obviously in our mopping up, hopefully we'll get to the rest of them. Let me go after this other target now, because there's a very good chance I could kill another 8 or 10. And the two guys that were left there, I didn't have too much qualms about them. Because you know what, if I didn't kill them today, I'd kill them tomorrow. That's how many gooks there were in the area. Where you talk about Mount Darwin, Centenary, down to Marawa, and to Bunjura, that kind of area there. In the early days, as I say, there might have been 100. Towards the end, there were about 600 in that area. So the target opportunity was so much more that, you know, you can't really compare what Doug Lambert and Charlie Horse achieved with what Jerry Strong and Pat Armstrong and Johnny Dawson, one or two other excellent KCAR commanders achieved. Again, with what myself and maybe Freddie Watts and Bruce Nelgar achieved in the whole of 79. I mean, the numbers were very different. You know, we were probably called out every other day. Pat Armstrong might have been called up twice a week, 3 times a week. And Charlie Horst and Doug Lambert might have been called up once a fortnight. So one can't really make a comparison between the guys, you know.
Nigel, you were really in the thick of it as a Fire Force commander for nearly, what, 2.5 years? That's 30 months.
Yeah, well, that's of course another factor. I mean, generally speaking, all the guys who were Fire Force commanders in the RLI, they had a period of office maybe of 18 months or 2 years at the very most. I mean, I was there for over 2.5 years. So the opportunities for me were much greater. I had probably I was probably more experienced in terms of what I'd seen. And, you know, so it's wrong to make the kind of comparison that you were the best or you were the best. You know, I mean, there's some great guys in this thing, right from the beginning to the end. So, you know, to be labeled as the best, I think is not correct.
Well, 30 months in that sort of intensity is quite something, Nigel. I've got to say. I mean, I don't know how many other soldiers living today would have been exposed to that much danger on so regular a basis. Just tell us a little bit about, I know it's not easy to do, but just a bit about your personal emotions, how you dealt with this intensity of exposure on so regular a basis.
Yeah, I think what I'd like to do is just go back a little bit, Hannes, and talk about how the enemy's tactics changed during the course of the thing. So that, and how we reacted to it, because it's terribly important that you understand how we got to where we were right at the end. Initially, you know, in the 75, 76, early 77 period, as soon as the Fire Force got overhead, the enemy tended to bomb shell. So it was relatively easy to see where they were going, put down your stops, and use the cannon to great effect. Then after about, I would say, the beginning of 78, they began to realize that actually, you know, doing all this running away is actually exposing us not very clever. So when the Fire Force arrived overhead, they wouldn't fire at the aircraft. They wouldn't do anything. They'd just lie low. And as the pattern developed around, they could see where the troops had been dropped. And the idea was that you were flying, as I say, generally a racetrack around this thing, and you could be a kilometer or 3/4 of a kilometer, say, for instance, from the target point. And their aim was to snivel as much as they could using glass, whatever cover they could, to get out of the orbit. Because once they were beyond the orbit, as I say, which might have covered 2 or 3 kilometers around the top, they were relatively safe. So that became the object. So it became very important for us to do very good planning. It wasn't a case of just rushing in and dumping a whole lot of guys and shooting, because the enemy were not apparent when you arrived there. And so consequently, you had to use a lot of ingenuity to try and seal off this area as well as you could. There might have been local an RAR platoon 5 kilometers or 10 kilometers away. You'd go and pick them up to try and block, or a party stick or something like that. So you got the maximum amount of troops on the ground. And then you have to carry out a very, very detailed search. You know, rock by rock, tree by tree, bush by bush, because you actually. Then what happened was they realized that that tactic was not working. So towards the end, I would say, beginning of 79 right through to the end, when there were a lot of gangs around, sometimes they would combine, so instead of having gangs of 10, there'd be gangs of 20 or 30. And as soon as the fire force arrived, boy, the flak that used to come up to the K-cars was something unbelievable. And what we did was we then went for a thing called jumbo fire force. As I said, you know, the normal fire force had four troop carrying aircraft and 1 K-car. When the South Africans really started to help us, I mean, each fire force increased to 8 troop carrying helicopters and 2 K-cars, which then gave you a tremendous amount of flexibility. Because if you were called to a target and there were only 10 guys there, you'd only use half of it, and then 5 minutes later another target came up, you'd send the other half with your 2IC on the other K-car over, and they'd get stuck into that one. And also, when they had these big positions of 30 and 40, and they were shooting, we wouldn't bother to pull up like we did 800 feet. At about 3 or 4 minutes out, maybe a bit longer, the two K-cars would pull ahead, and we'd go in at about 150 feet and just start shooting, because the flak was already coming at us. And it was better to be shooting from 150 feet than shooting from 800 feet, because they had a relatively slow target that they could see there that had no cover. If the target was under a lot of mosasa trees and there were 2 helicopters flying around and in and out of their vision all the time and blasting them, we found that a lot safer than, and it caused a lot of noise, a hell of a lot of confusion. So it was actually better to do that with a jumbo fire.
Tell us about your emotions, Nigel. What was going on inside?
Well, first, when I first started doing this, I was very concerned that actually, I wouldn't be up to snuff. I was very nervous and full of trepidation that actually I'd be letting my soldiers down, or, I wouldn't be able to perform the way I should perform. And once, after about a few months, and I'd got over that, I started getting relatively confident. I didn't quite get cocksure, but I have found a lot more confidence, and I was prepared to try and do a whole lot of other things that I hadn't before. And I got to the time where I thought, I'm top of the pops here, everything's going well, I've got no problems. And then I went through a period, I would say at the beginning of 1979, where, it was like every other day you were called out, or maybe twice a day. And every time you went 24/7, you were getting blasted by this ground fire. I thought to myself, well, you know what? I'm going to get the hammer. So, I've accepted that. So let's just get on and do it. And at the end, around about the end of 1979, I got to the stage where I thought to myself, well, you're going to cop it one way or another, dude, because, nothing, you've already outlived you're on the wrong side of the graph. And I mean, there were a couple of army commanders that were killed in the helicopter, and there were a lot that were wounded. I think Parance was wounded. I think Bruce Nelgar was wounded. And really, where you were sitting in the KCAR, you were the most vulnerable, because there were lots of everything, because of a left-hand orbit. You were the guy that would cop it first, and you, to a certain extent, shielded the pilots, which was fine by me, because rather him stay alive than me. I mean, at least the aircraft's good. So you were in a very vulnerable position, and I mean, in the end, most of the doors where the army commander used to sit were taken off the aircraft, because the perspex was so full of bullet holes you couldn't see out, and you'd get this kind of, when you knew you were in trouble was when you were, wasn't so bad where you're standing off at a bit of a distance shooting at the enemy, but where you got this drumming in the floorboards because you'd flown over them at about 50 feet, and suddenly the instruments were shattering, and it wasn't much fun.
Nigel, I know it's probably not an easy number to come up with, but just give us some idea of how many contacts you were involved in during your time as OC Support Commando.
Well, I was with Support Commando, as I say, for about 2.5 years. And, to the best of my recollection, I probably had over 100 contacts with them. During that period, and Support Commando probably had close to 150, because some of the time I wasn't there and my 2IC was officiating. But, you've got to think that during that period, we had 100, 120 contracts, 150 contracts, that we were probably called out 300 times. And certainly in the beginning, 77, halfway to 78, there were a lot of false alarms. But towards the end of 78, virtually for a year to 79, there were no more false alarms. Everyone was real. And it became a great strain.
Just go on then. There is a lot of controversy about how many contacts took place in any one day, and there are different stories about that. Just talk a little bit about that aspect.
Yeah, well, I've heard some figures of like 6 or 8 bandied around, Well, the reality of it is it's quite a simple mathematical problem, because one wave of Fire Force used 16 paras and 16 heli-borne troops, just 32 guys. Okay. And you got to one target, then you called out to another target. You'd probably leave 10 or something there fishing around and wrapping up parachutes and doing the odd sweep. And you'd go off with another 30 odd guys. Well, the end of it, I mean, the average commando RLI was good for about 2 call-outs a day. Was it 32 plus 32 is 64. You're then talking maybe they had 70 or 80 guys. So they couldn't have managed much more than about 2. I, for my sins, had like double the amount. But I mean, realistically, one, take into account Air Force, the requirements. You couldn't keep leaving this trail of destruction behind you as you hop from target to target. So I wouldn't think that, I did more than maybe 3 or 4 in one 24-hour period.
Again, I don't know if there's an accurate number, but roughly how many enemy were accounted for by Support Commando under your tenure?
Well, my best estimate is somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500, something like that. maybe a little bit less. If one took into account the external operations that we did, we'd probably get to 1,500. And sadly, you know, that was for the loss of 9 guys, I think, in support commando. 8, I think, yeah, during that period.
As a CO, it's a tough question, but how did you deal with the death of your troops? How did you deal emotionally and in reality with the death of your guys?
Oh, well, I mean, to me, it was a thing. I mean, if one of my guys was injured in the contact area or even was unfortunate enough to lose his life, the whole war stopped as far as I was concerned. I moved heaven and earth to do everything that I possibly could to get that guy the best help that I could in the shortest possible time. And the Air Force and I mean the K-car pilots and those guys, they got on and sorted out the rest of the war. But for me, the war stopped until we sorted out the troopy that had a problem. And you know, I mean, you feel so terribly responsible when something like that happens. And I mean, you do your best to safeguard against it, but you can't mitigate everything. The problem that we had quite often, you know, Zanla and Zapu and Zanla had very different tactics. Right to the end, Zapu guys in the belly guys. You got to a target, and they were mainly you took from Superlilo right around to Kariba. That's where they operated prisons.
Yeah.
Might bombshell off onto various escape routes, and then they would sit and wait. They'd never fire at the aircraft. They'd never fire at the troopies until the call sign was almost on top of them. And then they'd shoot one guy and then commit suicide with a grenade. Pull a grenade on themselves.
This was Zipra.
Zipra, yeah. That's Zipra, yeah. So it made it very difficult for the Zulu scouts to actually infiltrate Zipra because they never got any captures. Whereas Zanla, as I said, their modus operandi was entirely different. And, you know, we went through a period around about the Buzarewa elections where we lost, I think, 5 guys out of 8 in 1 month because of how hectic it was. And we were operating in Thrasher as far as Nyanga, north of the Nyanga, right down to Hot Springs. And we had 2 fire forces in there. Vernon Prinsloo, who was my 2RC at the time, did a wonderful job. But I mean, it was insane how many contacts we had in that period.
Very tough times. Nigel, the medal count, support commando.
Well, I mean, as I say, I had the most fantastic troopies in the world. We had a very definitive way of decorating people in the RLI, and that came from the top, not from me. And it was a very, very distinctive policy about how we did it. I've heard a lot of this stuff about the officers get all medals, and all this kind of tripe. But there was never like that in the RLI. And what used to happen was if it would come to after every action, my CSM would wander amongst the stick commanders and talk to the stick commanders and about this, as I would, but I mean, they would never open up to me as much as they'd open up to him. And he would gradually say, hey, listen, I think we need to investigate this because that guy seems to have done particularly well. So then we would call in everyone who'd been in the stick or been in the area with him, and we'd gradually form an idea of what happened there. And that process could take some considerable time because we wanted to make absolutely sure that we got the right guy, and maybe there were 2 or 3 of them, and that he was suitably decorated. And during the time I was in Support Commando, I think the troopers earned, I think, 1 Silver Cross, about 8 Bronze Crosses, I think, 9 MFC commendations, and 1 DMM. And that was, I mean, it was done strictly, absolutely fairly, with no favoritism shown or anything like that. And I mean, 1 or 2 of those guys that were awarded significant medals they weren't particularly popular guys, which just shows that actually it certainly wasn't a case of the majority think that he's a good guy, so give him the medal. It wasn't like that at all.
Nigel, maybe we can, when we talk again, you can tell us about some of these acts of bravery in our next segment. That'd be very interesting, and more about some of the specific contacts, some of the externals that Support Commando was involved in, and then I know there was always a funny side to everything in the RLI, and the RLI were very good at laughing at whatever was thrown at them. And maybe we can talk about some of those amusing incidents when we talk again. Thanks, Nigel, for your time today, and we'll pick up on that other stuff in a few days' time.
Okay.
Bernard Hacking, who I was at school with, got hold of me a little while ago just to remind me of the tragedy that befell the Hacking family. And I do remember actually responding to the attack when the Hacking family farm was attacked. So this all means a great deal to me. But his mother, Rose, who was a daughter of a pioneer family that came into Chipinga in 1894. Her father was actually born in Mount Selinda, near Chipinga, and so was Rose. But she married Ernie Hacking, who was also of Rhodesian stock, went on to play rugby for Rhodesia, but he was also a member of S Squadron, the long-range desert group deployed in the Western Desert to give Rommel a hard time. And Bernard pointed out he was actually one of at least 4 Manikas who served in the LRDG, including John Olivey, who I think was also from Malseta, Tom Bragg, and a chap named Mike Reynolds, who got a military cross. And it was from this pool of fighting men that David Sterling really recruited and formed the original SAS. Rose, unfortunately, was killed in 1977, I think it was. No, I think it was January 79. She was working the days at the Udzi Farmers Co-op, trying to supplement the meager income that the family were actually managing to make out of the farm. During the war, their operational options were so limited, money was very hard to come by. Rose sadly hit a mine and she was killed, but the Hacking cousins, Helen and Sue Turner, were also killed while opening the farm gate in Chipinga. Gavin Turner, who was actually at school with me, fantastic sportsman, rugby player. I think he played for Natal. Gavin survived. But Rose's brother, Ken Gifford, was also murdered in Chipinga while servicing his tractor, absolutely defenseless. He was gunned down and killed. So this is just another story of a tragic Rhodesian family, brave people trying to get on with their lives, who fell foul of a very unfortunate set of events. But I just wanted to mention that as a tribute to a great family.